Welcome back, everyone, to OpenLine. We are talking about a pre-K study over 13 years that studied the impact of pre-K on the students who were in there. We have with us Kelley Durkin. She is a research assistant professor at Peabody College. And it's really interesting to look into all of this research. I have several more questions, but one about COVID. Okay, so we just had COVID. Did COVID impact these findings? What did you find about COVID?
Sure. So when COVID hit, these students actually were in 9th and 10th grade, and they're in 8th and 9th grade. Then last year, during the whole year, they were in 9th and 10th, and now they're in 10th and 11th. So COVID happened when these students were starting to enter high school, essentially. And so we're just digging in now to what that means for them. We were fortunate to get new funding from the Institute of Education Sciences to look at that. But it does cause this opportunity to arise that we can look at COVID disruptions because we have so much data on these kids about what was happening before COVID and now what's happening to them now, that we can look to see how COVID may have affected things for them, including if, participation in VPK interacted in any way with the disruptions that they've experienced because of COVID in their schooling and in their families. And
VPK is voluntary pre-K. And what's so interesting about this is, as we discussed, you've studied these kids at different points along their lives. Mm-hmm. So right after the first year of pre-K, you studied and got some data and indicated there were advances. Mm-hmm. That was great. After 3rd grade, you studied the kids and were surprised because it didn't show that those advances were there, and it even showed, as you said, and I don't want to misstate it, but kids who didn't take pre-K did a little better. Mm-hmm. And then you've looked at 6th grade, and that surprising trend continued. And so my question is, were changes made? Let's go back to that 3rd grade point. Mm-hmm. Were changes made after seeing that 3rd grade data that was surprising? What were changes made?
Yeah, so the state went through, especially after these surprising negative effects came up, to try to make some structural changes to the program. And so they passed in the legislature the Pre-K Quality Act of 2016. And there's a whole bunch of things that legislation did, but some of the highlights were they moved from 37 approved curricula that programs could choose between to only 3 to try to focus in on what would be considered higher quality curricula for the programs to use. They enacted a process now where to get funding you have to submit this pretty intensive application and give some indication of quality or moving towards high quality in order to receive funding. And so they've done some different structural things like that. And I will point out too, Tennessee has things that other states' pre-K programs don't in terms of the teachers are paid similarly to teachers in the K-12 system. They require a bachelor's degree, and they meet 9 out of 10 of these benchmarks that this Early Education Institute say are really important for having the structures in place for a high quality program.
Do you feel better after those changes? Do you feel like those were good changes and we're closer to where we need to be or where we need to be? What do you think?
Yes, I think those were good changes, and I think are moving closer to where we need to be. And there are still things we should be doing to keep improving and get to where we need to be for these students. And I can go through.
Yeah, what are those things? What would you recommend?
Sure. And so one of the things would be trying to figure out ways to help teachers feel comfortable and increase these rich teacher-child interactions that we were talking about earlier. In a study that came out recently from programs in North Carolina, they found that only 4% of the day were students engaged in a, what they would consider a conversation between the teacher and the children, which would be a 3-way back and forth. So I say something, you say something, I say something, as opposed to just I ask a question, you answer it, and we're done. So having those more extended conversations only happened 4% of the time, and those were the things that were actually the most predictive of children's learning. So what can we do to get those kinds of interactions happening more in classrooms? We want to decrease the amount of large group time that these kids are in. Generally, I think a lot of people try to keep it to 10 minutes or less for these age, little 4-year-olds in a classroom to be in a large group setting, try to get them doing more play-based learning, using centers, small group time with the teacher rotating and facilitating. I mean, it's this sweet spot you have to hit. You don't want complete free play where the teacher's almost acting like a behavior monitor. and just like crowd control, because research has shown that's not great either. But you also don't want this very top-down teacher-led instruction. You want to hit the middle spot where they're playing, but it's this guided play, that the teacher's asking these open-ended questions, facilitating conversations, directing them to certain things, but letting them explore and engage in conversations with each other.
Which means, I guess, the kids in this research that didn't get into pre-K, again, they came from similar families because you all found a way to make that work. Perhaps maybe they were at home and they were talking about what's going to happen next, as opposed to what color is that. There was more of that play. I don't know, would watching, I don't know, it's a bad question. Would watching TV, if you were just parked in front of a TV, would that help? I don't know. You're a researcher. What if they watched OpenLine over and over and over? Or, I mean, I don't know, if they're just in front of a TV, or the ideal thing would be a family where they're having, great conversations all the time. Is that realistic in our world? I don't know, but that would be ideal. What do you think? I guess it indicates those kids who didn't go maybe had a little more open-ended conversation type thing going on.
Right, and we have some things that speak to that. So we don't know exactly what our control students were doing. We call them essentially the kids that didn't go to the pre-K program. We know that around 60% of them were in some kind of home-based care, so with a family member, a friend, or a neighbor in a home setting. The others did a mix of either Head Start, private care, or both. And so it's hard to say directly this is the benefit of VPK versus staying home or vice versa, because our control group is mixed in what they were doing. But we do think maybe some of those other places, particularly being in a home environment, maybe you had a chance to have some of those more open-ended conversations in some of the homes. Maybe it's the case that you got a little more freedom to run around and kind of, as my colleague Dale likes to say, bump into other kids and develop some of those skills. Because another thing we've been thinking about is, why do we see the negative effects on disciplinary infractions? What's going on there? And again, we can only speculate, but one of the things we've thought about is, when you're two adults trying to control a room of 20 children, a lot of times there's adult exerted control, sit down, put a bubble in your mouth, stay here, go here, and the kids maybe are missing a really important developmental period to develop those abilities to control their behavior themselves, that maybe, again, we're speculating, but maybe kids in these other settings, like being at home or with a family member, had a little more chance to develop those skills because of the setting that they were in.
That's so interesting. And so it just indicates education is so complicated. Mm-hmm. And it's so interesting to dig into it and look at this data, but it's just such a complicated process. And that's part of what you study. That's what your career is.
Right. That's part of why I like what I do.
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. But how when I sit here and say it's complicated, what do you say? How complicated is it?
I think it's complicated because there are also so many factors and variables that go into a kid's experience. And so even related to what we were just talking about, my colleague Alvin Pierman looked at the neighborhoods that these kids lived in. So all these students, in order to qualify for the voluntary pre-K program, had to come from households that met this income threshold and were low income. But they lived in all different places throughout the state. And so he looked at the density of poverty in the neighborhoods that they lived in. So how concentrated is the poverty in your neighborhood? And he found for kids that lived in the essentially kind of the poorest neighborhoods, there was a positive effect of being in the pre-K program compared to not. For those kids who were in the kind of better off potentially neighborhoods, more resourced, higher income neighborhoods, there was a negative effect. And it may be kind of what we were talking about before, this idea that it depends on what your alternative is, which is part of what makes it so complicated. If I don't go to the pre-K program and my alternative is staying with a loving grandma who talks to me lots and takes me to a safe, really nice public park with a really well-resourced public library, and I'm given all those opportunities, that may be a different experience than a kid who maybe lives in a neighborhood that's not as safe, that is parked in front of a TV, unless it's OpenLine.
Yeah, there we go.
Then maybe that is a much more negative environment for them than a really wonderful pre-K program they would have the ability to go to if they're in a high-quality classroom. And there's so much variability in the quality of classrooms too. So I think that's part of what makes it interesting but complicated. There's so much that can go into what kind of classroom they're going into and how high quality it is, and then also what the alternative experience it is and how high quality that is.
So let's say you're a parent out there and you have a young kid, or a grandparent, maybe you're a grandparent, and you want to learn what you can from this. What would you advise a parent or grandparent that's going to be watching a kid on a regular basis, you know, during the week? What would you advise?
Right, so I think it really is a lot about these conversations. So giving kids a lot of opportunity to talk, but then also listening to them and what they're talking about, you know, responding to them, trying to build on what they're doing, and just giving them exposure to lots of different kinds of activity that aren't just, hey, sit down and learn your letters. I think a really nice example that actually my daughter experienced in center-based care. I have a preschooler and she goes to a private preschool. But the other day when it was raining, her class went out and they dug a river in the sand and they built a dam. And she was so excited to tell me about it when she got home. And from the way she was talking, I knew the teacher, and a parent or grandparent could do this too, was guiding this conversation, talking about, well, what is a dam and how does it work? And which part of the river is the longest? And how are we gonna plan where to make the river go next? And it's these things that if you were walking by, you might think, oh, that's a kid digging in dirt, you know, digging in the sand. But there's actually a lot of rich things happening in those conversations that are helping her learn about measurement and volume and, you know, science and learning to communicate and problem solve and talking with other kids. And I think parents and grandparents can facilitate those kinds of conversations too.
That's great. I love that. All right, we will take a break. There's the number if you want to call in, 615-737-PLUS, 615-737-7587. We'll take a break. Be back right after this.